Senator from Oklahoma.
Can I inquire how much time I have remaining?
The senator from Oklahoma controls 112 minutes.
Thank you. I want to go back to the start of this again. The American people need to know what a hold is. What's a hold? A hold says that a bill is trying to go through the Senate without debate, without discussion. That by a unanimous consent, everybody agrees that we ought to pass the bill the way it is. And unfortunately, 70% of the bills that go through the Senate pass that way. The American people get to hear no debate, get to hear no knowledge about what's in the bills, no controversy about what it is. And a matter of fact, they don't know that the bill on the floor is actually different than the bill that passed out of committee. It's been modified, not with the vote of the committee, but with the direction of the chairman only. So the purpose of our hold is either you're against the bill, and I have no secret holds, everybody here knows that. When I hold a bill, everybody knows the bills I hold. And I give a reason for why I hold them. I don't hold them sheepishly. The purpose for a hold is to develop debate, to have the very discussion we're having on the floor. This bill was filed October 28th. It was brought to the floor week before last, without the ability to amend it, debate it, or discuss it. So the reason we're here today is so we can do just that. And I've stated numerous times, I've stated to the chairman of the committee, the ranking member of the committee, and others, I don't oppose, matter of fact, I'm for providing for our veterans. What I'm opposed to is us sinking our grandchildren in debt. Now, the senator from Alaska makes the claim or insinuates that I was here when the tax cuts came through. I wasn't. I believe when you do tax cuts, you match them with spending cuts. There's $350 billion a year in waste, fraud, and abuse that goes through this government every year. Not one amendment out of over 600 that have been offered has been agreed to by this body to eliminate some of that waste. Not one. Not one. Everybody that has spoken against this amendment or for this bill, with the exception of Senator Burr, has a 100% voting record for spending money. Not once do they vote against any spending bills. Not once. Since I've been in the Senate, 5 years. Not one of them that is opposed to paying for this has said, I see something wrong with this spending bill, it's not a priority, we ought to cut it, therefore I'm not going to vote for it. What in fact we've done it for. I've had criticism because the first year I was here, I actually voted for a war supplemental. But at that time we had a deficit of $110 billion, not $1.4 trillion. At that time we had an economy that was growing, not an economy on its back. At that time we had not totally mortgaged our children's future. It is time for all of us to change. It's time for all of us to make the same decisions that everybody outside of Washington has to make every day, which means you have to make a choice. You get to make a choice on what is a priority and what is not. For you see, our body, the supposed most deliberative body in the world, has a bias. And the bias is this: offend no one. Offend no one. How do you do that? How do you offend no one? You offend no one by taking the government credit card out of your pocket and put it into the machine and say, we don't have to make those hard choices. We're not going to offend anybody by cutting programs. We're not going to offend anybody with the $50 billion a year worth of waste at the Pentagon. The fact that 2 years ago the Pentagon paid out performance bonuses of over $6 billion to companies who didn't meet the performance requirements. You know, sadly, Not one American, not the federal government, got any of that money back. None of it came back. Because the other side of the story is we failed to do oversight. We failed to do the hard work that doesn't give you a headline, that is very hard work to hold the executive branch and agencies accountable. So our veterans do sacrifice. I'm for the Caregiver Act. I'm for us doing all these things. But I'm only for them if, in fact, we'll start making the same hard choices our veterans make, the same hard choices everybody else in this country makes when it comes to making a decision about the future. You see, a lot of people in our country today are underwater on their mortgages. They're underwater on our mortgages. Guess who else is? We are as a nation. We're underwater. We're underwater. Let me just compare, for example, what the financial situation is with our country. Medicare is broke. Part A will run out of money in 2017. 2017. We got 50 million baby boomers. I'm one of them, going into Medicare in the next 8 to 10 years. So not only is the cost per Medicare patient going to go up, but we're going to add 50 million to it. It's broke. Medicaid, it's broke. It comes out of your general tax revenue, but the states are broke over their share of Medicaid. The census, it's broke. It's going to cost 2.5 times what the last one did. Total mismanagement by the federal government. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, broke to the tune of $200 billion of your money, each one of them. $400 billion that your kids get to pay back. Your grandkids don't get the opportunities because they're broke. We've done such a wonderful job. Social Security, easiest to fix, but it's essentially broke because we've stolen $2.6 trillion from it and then not been honest with the American public about what our true deficit is. Because when I said a minute ago our deficit was $1.43 trillion, that's not true. That's Enron accounting. That's Washington accounting. The real deficit is well over $1.5 trillion because we stole more money from Social Security. Guess what? Next year, for the first time in the history of Social Security, more money will be paid out than will be paid in. First time. It runs in the red next year. Now, we owe money, so technically it's not broke yet till some of that $2+ billion goes back into it, but it's essentially broke. How about the post office? They just announced their loss for this year. They're going to have a bigger loss next year. It's broke. Cash for clunkers, that was broke when it started. Highway Trust Fund, it's broke. It's broke. We don't have enough money for what we've obligated to pay out. It's broke. And now we're talking about government-run health care, a $2.5 trillion program. That's what the real number's on it when you get the Enron accounting out of the bill that Senator Reid introduced last night, $2.5 trillion. And now we're saying we don't have the courage to pay to take care of our veterans. I don't think the American people are going to tolerate this much longer. Nor do I think they should tolerate it. That we will continue to steal the opportunity and future of our children. I think the senator from Alaska can be forgiven for not knowing all the abuse, fraud, and waste in the UN. Because every country he mentioned, UN peacekeepers have been accused of rape and pillaging the very people they were supposed to have been protecting. Every country he mentioned, UN peacekeepers that we pay for are raping the very citizens they're supposed to be protecting. And yet we don't have the courage to say, time out, we're not sending you any more money till you clean up the mess. No, we're not going to do that. We're not about to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to say we'll take the money for the veterans, from our grandchildren, and we won't make the hard choice. I think it'd be a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful message to send to the United Nations that maybe they ought to start being transparent about where the money goes. You realize nobody can know where the money goes? You don't get to know. I, as a senator, don't get to know. The president pro tem doesn't get to know where the money goes. Yet your country puts $5 billion a year into that, and you have no idea. The only way we find out is occasional leaks. And by the way, of all those UN peacekeepers that have raped and pillaged, not one of them's been convicted. Not one of the agencies in terms of their aid programs that have been incompetent and wasted money have been convicted. They're immune to conviction. The waste, fraud, and abuse of this country is only exceeded by one organization, and that's the United Nations. And yet we don't have the courage, because the State Department is against this amendment, and they send a letter outlining why they're against it, and I'm going to put into the record why they're wrong. And I ask unanimous consent at the end of this time that my statement on that comes in. But let me just give a little bit.
Without objection, so ordered.
The State Department Bureau of Legislative Affairs opposes this amendment. It lists a number of programs as reason to support the UN and oppose the Coburn Amendment. Many of the programs and activities that the State Department listed have experienced severe problems in execution or taking credit for activities by national governments or private entities. Let's just take the recent elections in Afghanistan. The United Nations cannot account for tens of millions of dollars provided to the Afghan Election Commission according to 2 UN audits. These are confidential, they weren't released. We just happened to be fortunate enough to have people that would give them to us. And interviews with current and former senior diplomats. The Afghan Election Commission, with over $20 million in UN funding and hundreds of millions of dollars in US funding, facilitated and helped mass election fraud and operated ghost polling places. Should we keep sending them money for incompetence, waste, and fraud? Everybody kept sending money to the Election Commission, said Peter Galbraith, the former deputy chief of the UN mission in Afghanistan. Nobody put the brakes on US taxpayers, spent hundreds of millions of dollars on a fraudulent election. This is a deputy to the senior UN official in Afghanistan. He was fired last month after protesting fraud in elections. He protested the fraud and he got fired by the UN, that wonderfully competent organization. As of April 2009, the UN had spent $72.4 million supporting the Electoral Commission, with $56.7 million of that money coming from the U.S. Agency for International Development. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction states that the United States provided at least $263 million in funding for that election. In one instance, the United Nations Development Program paid $6.8 million for transportation costs in areas where no UN officials were present. But we paid transportation costs, but no UN officials were present. Why did we pay it? Where'd that money go? Where's the money? Overall, the audits found that UN monitoring of U.S. taxpayer funds was seriously inadequate. In other words, it's there, they send it out, they don't have any idea, but you can bet well-connected people to people at the UN are making millions off U.S. dollars. How about the monitoring of nuclear programs in North Korea and Iran? In 2002, the North Korean government used United Nations Development Program money, UNDP money, that aid to purchase, this is aid for them for development from the UN. They purchased conventional arms and ballistic missiles. With money we gave the UN turns around, gives it to North Korea, and they buy missiles and arms. There's a real problem at the UN. We won't face up to it. It also transferred millions of dollars in cash to the government of North Korea with no oversight on how the money was spent. No oversight. Just handed them millions of dollars of cash. In September 2009, North Korea announced to the United Nations Security Council that it was almost complete in weaponizing nuclear materials from its nuclear reactor. Last week, North Korea announced that the processing was complete. We helped finance it through the United Nations. We helped finance it through the United Nations. As of this morning, Iran had rejected the UN offer to send enriched uranium out of the country to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons. We don't know how much UN money's gone in there yet. I promise you I'm going to try to find out. But I can guarantee you millions has been wasted of our dollars that could pay for our veterans, or we can just borrow it from our children. UN contribution, funding 17 UN peacekeeping operations, including those in Haiti, Liberia, Lebanon, Darfur, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. UN peacekeeping operations are plagued by rape and sexual exploitation of refugees. From 1994 forward, 68 separate incidences of rape, prostitution, and pedophilia. 68 separate times. And we pay half of the UN peacekeeping costs. We don't manage the money, the UN manages the money. What would happen if a U.S. troop was doing that? And yet, we have no control. In 2006, reported, BBC News, peacekeepers in Haiti and Liberia were involved in exploitation of refugees. You can read that at BBC News, November 30th, 2006, if you want to look it up. In 2007, leaked reports indicate the UN has caught 200 peacekeepers for sex offenses in the past 3 years, ranging from rape to assault on minors. Not one of them has been prosecuted. Not one. Just this month, Human Rights Watch reported that Congolese armed forces, supported by UN peacekeepers in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, have brutally killed hundreds of civilians and committed widespread rape in the past 3 months in a military operation backed by the United Nations. That's this month. Yet we continue to send billions of dollars every year to the United Nations. I would be happy to yield for a procedure question.
Speaking on behalf of the amendment of bill, and I know that the senator has time allocated under the unanimous consent request, and I would like to ask him at his convenience if he has a time when he would be able to yield to this side, or is he going to speak, use all of his time?
I do not plan on consuming all of it at this time. I've got about 10 or 15 minutes more to go, and I'd be happy to. Are you wanting time?
Could I ask unanimous consent that when you break or prepared to yield the floor, at least temporarily, that I be recognized next?
I have no objection to that.
Without objection, so ordered.
Going back to the Congolese, most of the victims were women, children, and the elderly. Some were decapitated. Now remember, these are UN peacekeeping forces. Peacekeeping. Others were chopped to death by machete, beaten to death with clubs, or shot as they tried to flee. Now, they may not have been actual UN officers, but the UN was supplying all the logistics, all the transportation for this group of people. Where's the oversight? Compiling forecasts of global agricultural production and identifying areas of likely famine and risk of severe hunger to facilitate food assistance, we make a contribution to the UN. The Food and Agricultural Organization, a UN conference, a food summit in Rome, where the opening speaker is Zimbabwe President Robert Mugabe, who has literally destroyed his nation which used to be the breadbasket of Africa, who's now dependent on food imports, we're helping pay for him who can't travel hardly anywhere else in the world because he's such a rogue dictator. We're sponsoring, through our dollars, meetings where he is the headline speaker. The meeting was branded a failure within a couple of hours of its start after the 192 participating countries unanimously rebuffed the United Nations appeal for commitments of billions of dollars in yearly aid to develop agriculture in poor nations. It's not because they don't care about people having problems with food. Is they recognize the UN is ineffective at doing that. And they're not going to commit more money. But we continue to commit more money. The UN Environment Program spends $1 billion a year, 20% of it our money, on global warming and its effect on agriculture. The UN has coordinated efforts by the global shipping industry and governments to prevent and respond to acts of piracy on the high seas. It was totally ineffective. You know why we've decreased the amount of piracy on the high seas? It's because of Task Force 51, which was formed by the United States Navy, because the United Nations was totally ineffective in accomplishing that purpose. I can go on and on. But the fact is, the United Nations is not only morally bankrupt in its leadership and efficiency, it is filled with fraud, waste, and, as noted, tremendous acts of violence through the peacekeeping armies that it sends throughout the world. And yet we're going to have people say we shouldn't take some of that money away. We're not taking all the money away with this amendment anyway. We're just taking a small portion to pay for our veterans. We're going to have people actually vote to continue to do these things instead of take care of our veterans and not steal it from our children. You know, I heard Senator Tester speak about the wonderful things in this bill to help people who drive to VA clinics and VA hospitals. You know, there's a better idea. If a veteran is deserving of care, give them a card. Let them go wherever they want. Why should they have to drive 160 miles when they can get the care right down the street from somebody they trust and they know? But instead, we say, we're going to promise you health care, but you can only get it here. Real freedom for our veterans, real health care for our veterans is to honor their commitment by saying, here's your card, you served our nation, go get your health care wherever you want. If you want to get it next door, if you want to go to the VA hospital, you can. Or if you want to go to MD Anderson or Mayo Clinic, wherever you want to go, you can go buy it because we honor your commitment. We're not going to say you have to be here. And I recognize that our VA hospitals have done a magnificent job in improving their care. But I'd tell you the test for the VA hospital system is this. Go ask any doctor coming out of training who experienced part of their time in a VA hospital and ask them to choose for their family. You want your family treated at a VA hospital or somewhere else where you train? Nary a one will pick a VA hospital because the care isn't as good. It's better, and it's getting better all the time, but it's not as good. And so we're handing veterans saying, here's where you got to go. When what we should say is, here's your service, here's what we owe you, go get it wherever you want to get it, where you think you can get the best treatment for you. On prosthetics, the VA is the best in the world. Nobody compares. On post-traumatic stress disorder, they're the best in the world. Nobody compares. They're underfunded in those areas. This bill's right on that. But the real commitment is to give the choice. The veteran fought for freedom. Give them the choice and the freedom to choose what they want for them. Why is it important? Why is it important that we change how the Senate operates in terms of making hard decisions? The reason it's important is there's millions of these little girls out there. Little boy, I got 5 of them, 5 grandkids, just like it. And she's got a little sign around her neck. And she says, I'm already $38,375 in debt, and I only own a dollhouse. And of course, when you divide up the $12 trillion, which we passed this week, in direct owned debt, doesn't count the trillions that we have borrowed from Social Security and the other trust funds like the Inland Waterway Trust Fund and all these other organizations that we've stolen. Doesn't include that. But that's for every man, woman, and child in this country. And it's over $30,000 now this year. I think you look at her and you have to say, certainly, we ought to be making some changes. And oh, by the way, that number goes between now and 2019 to over $96,000 per man, woman, and child. But she's a child. And this doesn't apply to our veterans, but it applies to almost everything else that we're doing. This is Thomas Jefferson. He said, our democracy will cease to exist when you take away from those who are willing to work and give to those who would not. Well, if you think about what's really happening in our country right now and how things are being shifted, what we're doing is we're on the cusp of a dramatic change in our country in terms of balance. This huge bill, which I'll talk about later, is a major move in that direction. Senator Byrd and I were talking this morning about this. In this bill is a 5% tax on cosmetic surgery. Just yesterday, day before yesterday, U.S. Preventative Task Forces Services recommended, because it's not cost effective, that women under 50 not get mammograms unless they had risk factors. Well, you tell that to the thousands of women who were diagnosed with breast cancer last year under 50 with a mammogram. You tell them it's not cost effective. But also in this bill is a 5% tax on the breast reconstruction surgery after they've had a mastectomy. They're going to tax having your breast rebuilt after your breast has been taken off because it is elective plastic surgery. It is elective cosmetic surgery. Yeah, we're going to have a tax on it because we've taxed elective cosmetic surgery. We are in trouble as a nation because we've taken our eye off the ball. I see the majority whip is back, and I told him that I would be happy to yield. So let me at this time keep the remaining balance, reserve the balance of my time, and yield the floor to the majority whip.